In the early 16th century, Scotland suffered a series of devastating defeats, which scored the Scots a reputation of military backwardness. At the battles of Flodden, Solway Moss and Pinkie, though numerically superior, Scottish armies were well beaten by the English. To many, the armies of Scotland seemed almost archaic compared to the orderly forces of continental Europe. The historian G.J. Millar has even called them, quote, the English crown's most backward of adversaries. Still, this allegedly most backward of adversaries did not succumb to the English, denied them substantial territorial gains, and even went on the offensive. Hence, we need to ask how such a supposed relic of all times kept up with the modern armies of the period. In some sense, the Scottish indeed followed an old ideal of warfare. Many armies increasingly relied on pike and shot tactics, deployed professional forces, and were perfecting the use of gunpowder weapons, such as, for example, the Spanish with their famous tercios. The Scottish, however, still mustered commoners through a system of personal bonds that resembled feudal levies. Although there was a tradition of Highlanders serving as mercenaries in Ireland, and some had fought in the service of France, a long-standing Scottish ally, there were few professional soldiers. The bulk of Scottish armies still consisted of men levied from the male population for a particular campaign only. These were called to arms by a national levy system and the so-called man-rent contracts between a man and his lord. All men between 16 and 60 had to serve a maximum of 40 days per year at their own expense, and keep ready weapons appropriate to their role. This was ensured at 2 to 4 annual musterings, so-called weapon showings. One of the main advantages of this system was to make sure that every man had at least a pike, some light armor, and a simple helmet readily available. In addition, raising an army this way was incredibly cheap, and could generate substantial numbers quickly, especially for defensive purposes. All in all, the historian Gervais Phillips stresses the fact that this military system produced relatively simple armies, especially compared to the ones of Scotland's most direct rival England, but they were not really backward. Before we go any further, I'd like to introduce the sponsor of today's video, MyHeritage, a company specializing in family history who made me aware of some distant relatives who are actually from England, which I didn't know at all. I found out by using their massive database holding over 19 billion searchable records. MyHeritage allows you to compare names, facts such as birthplaces and other connections intelligently to the millions of family trees contributed by other users. Their Smart Matches technology works across differences in spelling or phonetics that may exist between the trees to offer a large quantity of highly accurate matches. Once you have added a few relatives, you can also make use of their instant discovery feature, which lets you add an entire branch of your family tree by a simple click of a button. The cherry on the top is MyHeritage's photo restoration tool. For example, you can simply upload old photos of family relatives and enhance them by removing scratches. You can even colorize and animate your photos, bringing your ancestors to life. MyHeritage connects people that didn't know they had a connection. I, for one, didn't know much about my family's origin. MyHeritage helped me find distant relatives with fairly little effort. If you're up for it, sign up for the free trial. And if you decide to continue your subscription, you'll get 50% off if you use the link in the description below this video. In regard to weapons and tactics, the Scottish were not too far behind. By the early 16th century, the pike had become the standard weapon, although axes, swords, and other pole arms were used too. A notable exception were the men from the Highlands and the Western Isles. They preferred bows, a shield with an axe or broadsword, or the infamous claymore, a huge two-handed sword of about 140 centimeters in length. Tactically speaking, Scottish armies heavily relied on the aggressive use of pike formations. When attacking, they advanced in, quote, good order after the German manner, end quote. In fact, they relied on an emulation of the earlier Scottish schiltron, the Swiss pike square and the stratified pike squares of the German Landsknechts. Like these models, Scottish armies were divided into a vanguard, a main battle, and a rearguard. A small band of warriors, resembling the Landsknecht's forlorn hope, was tasked with opening a gap in the enemy formation, while contingents of Highlanders would skirmish in front of the army. Notably, similar infantry formations were also used well into the 16th century on the continent. While the infantry made up the bulk of any Scottish army, they were supported by cavalry, archers, and artillery. The cavalry mainly consisted of light horse, ideally suited for raiding and scouting. Although they had a hard time in direct encounters with the heavier English cavalry, especially the demi-lancers fielded as of the 1530s, the Scottish light cavalry made its presence felt on campaign. By ambushing convoys and patrols, they could bring the English close to despair. This became apparent in the 3-year struggle after the Battle of Pinkie, when the English tried to follow up on their victory. While the English maintained isolated garrisons in Lothian and along the Scottish border, the Scottish light cavalry was giving them more than a hard time. One aspect in which Scotland was indeed somewhat behind is missile support. In the 1530s, when arquebuses and muskets increasingly dominated continental warfare, the production of bows and crossbows was still running high in Scotland. However, this was irrelevant, as there was simply no need to adopt firearms just yet. The primary opponent of Scotland was England, which also heavily relied on archers well into the 16th century. England began to deploy arquebuses and muskets in more significant numbers only after Henry VIII had invaded France, together with Charles V in the 1540s, and received a crash course in all things bastion fort and handgun. Suddenly, there was a need for modern fortresses and gunpowder weapons on the British Isles. But Scotland quickly adapted, and by the end of the 1560s, its shot department was dominated by handguns too. Things were different with gunpowder artillery. James III introduced it mainly along the coasts for defensive purposes, while his son, James IV, came to rely on it offensively in order to assert his authority. In 1491, for example, he used the Royal Artillery to capture the rebel fortresses of Ducal, Crookstone and Tantallon. The first guns were imported from France, but in 1511 James IV appointed a Scottish master gunner, Robert Rothwick, to maintain a Royal Artillery train of guns of Scottish manufacture. Likewise, James equipped his navy with artillery, which was necessary to control his kingdom of many isles and project his power overseas. Within his reign, the annual expenditure of the navy exploded from £140 to £8,700 per year, peaking in the manufacture of the Great Michael, one of the first ships capable of firing a broadside. The investment was well worth it, as James created a strong Scottish fleet that was able to undertake amphibious operations. This helped him a great deal to enforce royal authority in the far-flung corners of his realm and altered Anglo-Scottish relations drastically. In fact, his impressive artillery train gave him considerable leverage over the English crown. In 1496 and 1497, he even intervened in English affairs and demonstrated clearly that Scotland was a force to be reckoned with. In September of 1496, he crossed the Tweed with a large army in support of a pretender to the English throne, Perkin Warbeck. James didn't make it far, and immediately fell back when an English army under Thomas Howard, Earl of Surrey, approached. But he crossed the border again next year and laid siege to Norham Castle. Although he retreated again when a relief army approached, these two incursions into English territory demonstrated that James had the means to bring his guns and army into England. After a failed campaign of retaliation, Henry VII of England had no choice but to open negotiations. James reaped considerable diplomatic dividends, including his marriage to Henry's daughter Margaret, and the Treaty of Perpetual Peace in 1502. He proved that he was a wise monarch, competent administrator and cautious strategist, who drastically increased Scotland's political importance on the British Isles and in Europe in general. This brings us to the second point that shows that the Scottish were in fact not backwards. As James's success demonstrated, the Scottish army was quite different but quite effective. The Scottish defeats at Flodden, Solway Moss and Pinkie cannot be explained by cutting-edge English armies defeating 3 larger but backward Scottish hosts. At Flodden, James IV was simply outmaneuvered. He awaited the English in a strong position on Flodden Edge, between a marsh and a steep slope, so the only way to approach was straight at the muzzles of his guns. When his scouts reported that the English were on the move, James thought they would make camp or march for Scotland. But the English marched around the Scots and drew up in James's back. Although he reacted quickly, his artillery couldn't properly aim down the hill, so that the English could avoid most of the cannon fire. Nevertheless, it was only after a fierce fight that the Scottish were defeated. James and most of the nobles who were leading from the front with him were killed, and so were about 5,000 commoners. So Flodden was pretty much an even battle, decided by clever English maneuvers. The defeats at Solway Moss and Pinkie were somewhat similar. On the misty Solway Moss, 15,000 to 18,000 Scottish soldiers were surprised by a charge of English horse and immediately thrown into disorder. After that, they thought a poorly coordinated battle, were quickly cornered between a marsh and the river Esk and surrendered after a short fight. At Pinkie Cleuch, the cinematic battle of the so-called Roth Wooing, finally, the regent of Scotland, James Hamilton, Earl of Arran, abandoned a solid position to catch the attacking English on the move. However, this turned out to be a mistake when the English cavalry and artillery stopped the advance of the Scots. Soon, Hamilton found himself under fire from all sides, and his army disintegrated. The Battle of Pinkie is considered the first proper pike and shot battle on the British Isles. So, the outcome of none of these battles was predetermined by Scottish military backwardness. What is more striking is the Scottish resilience in the aftermath of these defeats. The English were unable to follow up on their successes. The prolonged border wars after Flodden and Solway Moss came to nothing. Only after Pinkie there was some lasting effect. Over the next 2 years, several English garrisons in modern bastion forts were established to occupy Scotland. But the Scottish, supported by their French allies, stiffly resisted. By cutting off supply lines, ambushing troops, and other actions of local resistance, they harassed the English and finally drove them back. In general, Scotland constantly dealt its southern neighbour small-scale defeats, resisted its incursions, and denied it any substantial progress. Scotland also won battles, for example the Battle of Haddon Rig in 1542 or Ancrum Moor in 1545. At Ancrum Moor, the Earl of Angus ambushed the English army that was pillaging the hinterland of Edinburgh after they burnt down the town. Feigning a retreat, a small body of Scottish light cavalry lured the English across Ancrum Moor straight into a solid pike square at a narrow section of a street. In a fierce battle, 1,000 English were taken captive and 800 killed. Too often, Scotland is seen as passive and constantly on the defensive. This was not the case at all. Flodden and Solway Moss were both the consequence of a Scottish offensive. In case of Flodden, James IV was even the one to break the perpetual peace between Scotland and England by invading England in support of France, which had been attacked by Henry VIII. This also shows that Scotland was an important player on the political stage of Europe, especially in the triangle France, England, Scotland, but also well beyond it. Scotland cost England dearly, as it was an ongoing threat and sometimes even checked English initiative by harassing it at home. Yes, the simplicity of Scottish field armies had its drawbacks. Yes, Scotland's armies adopted pike and shot tactics somewhat later, and yes, they lost the 3 biggest battles of the 16th century. But the Scottish military, in general, was neither backward nor ineffective, as was proven both in battle and small-scale warfare. On the contrary, Scottish armies adapted to situational needs, and with their cheap yet effective armies, they were a thorn in the side of the English. Scotland showed extraordinary resilience against English incursions, prevented any substantial and lasting English success on the Isles, and significantly impacted Europe's broader political sphere. Thanks for watching our video. If you'd like to support our channel, please consider donating via Patreon. Our videos take a lot of time to research and illustrate, and we're still trying to cover these costs with a more regular income.